when you're dealing with money and investments, it's all very logical, right? The numbers are the numbers. There's a logic to what you're doing. But actually, you have to take this messy side of how people feel about those into account. And so, good financial advisors are able to do the money side, right? Do the logic and manage those differences in perceptions of fairness and how people feel about it. Because ultimately, if it doesn't feel right, or if there's a feeling of this is unfair, it doesn't matter how right the numbers are. It's the feeling is going to overwhelm it and create problems.
Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the It's Never About Money podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Phil Pryor, joining us to discuss family dynamics and harmony as a pillar to a meaningful life, and it's something that we've spent quite a bit of time on in previous seasons of this podcast. So Phil is the CEO and founder of Family Business Central, operating in New Zealand and Australia. Phil has over 28 years of experience, has worked with family business owners and executives across the globe, including London, New York, and Sydney. Phil's unique approach combines his extensive business expertise with a deep understanding of family psychology and change management. And I'm really, really excited to have Phil on because we really want to discuss how money can be a roadblock to family harmony. And we'll also explore how successful families have an uncanny ability to leverage financial resources to maintain or potentially even improve family harmony. So we've highlighted this in previous episodes. We've had experts like Alex Kirby, Martin Toburn, Maya Marcus from Kids in Philanthropy on this particular season, and family, and have really discussed family and relationships and the key aspects of life satisfaction for all of us humans. Phil's insights have been featured on TV, radio, and at numerous conferences, making him a trusted advisor to many high-profile family businesses. So today, we will explore how fostering positive family dynamics can lead to both business success and fulfilling personal life. So, long intro. Hello, Phil. Welcome.
Morning, Joe. Good to see you.
Well, Phil, great to have you on. And as I said before, it's I listened to you present at as part of a group that I'm part of, and I was incredibly curious. And when I'm incredibly curious about someone and the subject matter, it's a telltale sign that I should at least investigate whether they should be on the podcast. And we did that, and I'm excited to have you on because I really am. I'm really of the firm belief that when it comes to the intersection of money and life satisfaction and meaning in life, one of the greatest pillars is family and relationships. And without fostering good relationships within our family, doesn't matter how much money we have. In fact, money can be a real problem, right? So,
yeah.
So we'll just kick off, I think, Phil, with sharing a little bit about your background and experience in advising family business and family dynamics. Sure.
Where I really started in this was actually in the US, and I was working. I was working clinically as an individual and family therapist in the US when I was in my 20s. And I was working with primarily wealthy families, and it was extraordinary. Actually, they had all this money, and yet there was such distress in the family and family members, and the money not only didn't improve things, it sometimes, as you said, made it worse. And so as I've moved through my career, and I stepped away from the specific clinical work and moved into working with families that run businesses or where there's a large transfer of wealth about to happen or happening, and even family offices. There's so much potential, and yet there's also areas where you really got to be very careful. So I talk about it in terms of you're risking it all, right? In a family business context, right? You're combining your two most precious things, your family, in terms of the source of emotional nourishment and support, and your business, which is your source of identity and income and all that sort of thing. And so you're potentially putting both of those at risk. And at one level, getting it right is not that difficult, but there are things you really got to be thinking about, because if it goes wrong, it's just a disaster. And I've worked with a couple where it's just been horrible, even as an outside observer, watching a family disintegrate. And grandparents not seeing grandchildren, and siblings not talking to one another, and it's just awful. And so while as you say, it's never about the money, right? And I've used that exact phrase several times into many different families. But it's a matter of setting things up so that actually you can take advantage of what has been achieved and with their wealth and how they do that. And as I said, there's not a great deal of complexity, but there are some very important things to be thinking about and looking at.
Yeah, it strikes me as analogous, and I don't have kids myself, but they talk about the fact that, in a relationship, things might be okay when both of you are together, and then all of a sudden you have a child, and then it unearths the cracks that were maybe already there, but just were low stakes at the time, or under a low pressure environment. I wonder whether your comment around when more money becomes when money is more abundant, when it's more prevalent, when we move up the hierarchy in terms of socioeconomic status, whether the stakes are higher and therefore the little problems that exist within relationships, whether it be communicative or otherwise, actually are more obvious in those scenarios. Is that what makes money a problem in relationships?
Look, I think there's a couple of issues there. Where money creates a problem is that, and I've seen this happen a lot, is where you use money to parent. So you outsource your parenting because you've got money, because you can afford to pay for all sorts of things. You sort of miss out. You as I said, you effectively outsource it. Kids, regardless of the wealth of the family, there are certain things that kids need, right? In terms of being loved, being parented, clear boundaries, clear messages, feeling safe, right? And our family is where we go. It's, if we're, later in life when, maybe in our 20s and our heart is broken or whatever, we go back to family, right? It's that source of emotional nourishment. And so the challenge with money at times can be we either use it to outsource, or we're so busy making it, we stop being parents.
Yeah. Yep.
And that can, so you get that sort of whole distant parent thing.
That's really interesting. I love that analogy because I kind of think about a business, right? Sometimes we outsource so much that we lose our actual capacity to understand what it is that we do really well internally. Yeah. We've kind of gutted the business to an extent.
We become a conductor with other specialists rather than actually knowing what our business is.
Yes. Or what we do extraordinarily well, which is what your point is around parenting, right? Like,
yes.
Yep.
Yes. And so again, regardless of money, kids need stuff from us as parents. And, there's often a lot of wealthy parents have asked me in terms of, well, what do we do? What do we tell our children about money? Because it's obvious, they live in bigger houses, they drive cars, they fly first or business class and that sort of thing. I'm less worried about that. I think actually kids handle information remarkably well, obviously age appropriately, but they still have some fundamental needs as children on that.
I just want to frame this conversation as well to our audience, regardless of where you are in your socioeconomic status. I think the purpose of having Phil on today is to get his observations of those that he's working with who do have a fair bit of money, and that can actually give us a really good indication of what the issues are with having quite a bit of money and what are the fundamentals that we should all focus on regardless of the amount of financial resources we actually have. What are the key fundamentals? Because they get unearthed, right? Because if you've got an abundance of money and you've got enough money for the next 10 retirements, and you still have problems, it's telling you that there are some key aspects of human nature that need to be adhered to and dealt with. And comments around that, Phil.
Look, there's a number of areas, right? I mean, every family, no parent is perfect, and often, things that we've experienced in our own childhood, we start almost recreating as parents. The challenge, I think, for parents is, there's several. One is, actually parenting well, and so a lot of parents, I think, strive to be too nice, and particularly when their children are young. And kids need boundaries, they need clear messages, and they relax through that. But then the problem, you'll often get parents who are very good at that. But then as the children get older, and I particularly look at this through the succession lens, where the kids are in their 20s, maybe even 30s, but the parents are still trying to control what they do, how they do it, and that sort of thing. And in fact, there is a total evolution of the relationship. So the relationship you have with your child when they're 2, 5, 10, even 12, right, is one thing. But as children get older, and it's a transition that a lot of parents struggle with money or without, right? It starts to become a more adult relationship. And I've seen parents try and control money towards their children. They don't want to give them too much leeway. And all that does is just breed enormous levels of resentment. In the worst case, of course, is trying to control from the grave via your will and what you do and what people can do and can't do. Kids are themselves. And equally, you'll sometimes get very clever, very entrepreneurial parents who want their children to be the same. And a lot of the time
they're not biologically inclined to it.
Not. That's right, exactly. And they may not have that extraordinary entrepreneurial flair.
Yeah.
I've got several families where, the parents are extraordinarily entrepreneurial, and, a couple of their kids are musicians, right? And they're doing gigs around the country. And actually, that's worked fine. The parents are absolutely fine with that. But equally, if you're trying to shape your kids into a mini-me, it will invariably backfire.
So what you're kind of talking about, Phil, is this idea that as when a parent is parenting a younger child, the power dynamic and the rules and the boundaries may be very well defined, very clear, and actually suitable at that particular age. But that emotional pattern or that relationship pattern needs to morph from a power dynamic into a more peer-to-peer.
Absolutely.
And this is where the problems exist, right? And I think this is a universal problem, right? Change is hard for people, particularly where that algorithm is enshrined. And so what you're saying, I think, is that when you come across problems, a lot of the time it's to do with, and this is intergenerational, parenting styles that have not necessarily evolved past childhood adult dynamics.
It's one of them, and there's plenty of others, right?
Okay.
It's often I can't, when I get involved, the kids have grown up at that point. But there is, we need to be looking sometimes at there's sometimes patterns set up, and we might need to find ways to start shifting some of those patterns. You've got plenty of other issues here. The other big one is conflict of some sort, often between siblings.
Yes.
And that often kicks in, that's often around a sense of fairness or lack of fairness, perceived fairness, by the way. It is a perception, it's not necessarily a reality. So you've got a number of factors here, because every family that's got, money to pass on or assets to pass on, the drive is very clear. They want this to be, something that's beneficial and good and positive in their children's lives, after them. I don't hear many parents saying, I want to really screw my kids up with my money. And so, but often unintentionally, the issues start coming in, and fairness is a critical one, and that ability to, or inability to, actually have the conversations that need to be had, and what that means, and how, the parents don't want to upset their kids, or they don't want to raise issues, or they're worried about that, and often that avoidance actually just makes it worse.
Yeah. So is it again about this sort of the sort of communicative way that a parents that actually determines this feeling of a lack of fairness? And can you define and distill the difference between fairness and equality for us, so we can actually have a conversation about that?
Yeah, and it's a really good point. Look, it's not just communication around the fairness stuff. There's a fair bit more, but the distinction between fairness and equality, and it comes really to, it's not about the money. Fairness is a perception, and often it's driven by experiences that they've had in the family in the past. So you might feel, there might be one child who feels like they've just always been hard done by. Or that their sibling is the golden child, and sometimes this is reinforced completely inadvertently with that. So when I look at siblings, and I've worked with siblings of all ages, I basically say that they're always looking. Is it fair? Am I getting what they're getting? And so there's that sense of it might be fairness of opportunity. It might be access to resources. It might be a fairness of I'm not loved as much. And so I've done worked out agreements within families where most of the money has actually gone to one sibling, because they wanted to take on in terms of value, they wanted to take on the business. And the other siblings were delighted with that, but they wanted other more emotional things. So it wasn't equal. I mean, clearly, there was, in one case, there was probably $4 or $5 million worth of difference in terms of what one kid was effectively getting versus the others. But they were happy with that. So it wasn't the money. It was around that emotional connection and other opportunities that we were able to create.
So you're saying fairness is more important than equality in
Absolutely.
that example?
Yeah, because you can have equal, or you can have what might be seen. Like I've come across parents who've said, well, okay, the distribution, say, of in a business of shares, in terms of the amount of input that one child's done has been far greater than the amount of input that another child has done. So I will skew the shareholding that way, right? 80-20 or something like that. They think that is fair because it's based on the input. Now, I've had several cases where the kids, when they've heard those sort of numbers, have gone, they've just hit the roof. And in one case, one child said, well, he's getting that much, he's getting 20%. And another one who said, I'm only getting 20%, I'm only worth 20%. So you've got this whole emotional sort of connection that is totally removed actually from the numbers.
It's interesting. That's super. I mean, it's incredibly interesting. I wonder whether, when we think about fairness, there's fairness from the parents' point of view, and this is what we're going to impose, and this is what we think is fair.
Yep.
But what I think you're expressing, correct me if I'm wrong, is a kind of more holistic fairness where everyone's engaged in a kind of consensus idea of what might be fair, and that all stakeholders in the family unit have been actually had discussions and asked questions and then formulated what their view on fairness might be.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's so the parents' perception of, is this, well, this appears fair to us, but it does not appear fair to the siblings. So, and it goes back to the parents and the kids being able to have the honest conversations around, well, how do you see it all? How do you feel about it all? And so ironically, when you're dealing with money and investments, it's all very logical, right? The numbers are the numbers. There's a logic to what you're doing. But actually, you have to take this messy side of how people feel about those into account. And so, good financial advisors are able to do the money side, right? Do the logic and manage those differences in perceptions of fairness and how people feel about it. Because ultimately, if it doesn't feel right, or if there's a feeling of this is unfair, it doesn't matter how right the numbers are. It's the feeling is going to overwhelm it and create problems.
I'm curious as to what the successful families are doing, and let's make it agnostic to the level of financial resources that they have. But in any family, what are the most successful families doing so that this, as an example, competitive nature, this between siblings, this feeling of inequity, doesn't rear its ugly head? What are they doing? What's the model?
I wish there was one very simple model, but there are some are some good broad guidelines, right?
Yep.
I think, and I'm talking here particularly, parents with money, when there's wealth there. I think it is very important for the parents and the family to be aware of their values. What is really important to them? Right. And often it's the question, what is the purpose of our wealth, or what does it mean to be part of this family? And if it's just to make more money, actually that doesn't really answer the question. So if you've got more money than you actually need, you don't have to work, you set the next 10 generations up. Why are you making more money? Right. So what is the purpose? What are the values? And I think that the really successful families have conversations about that, even when kids are young. And obviously it's age-appropriate type of conversations, and more importantly, it's demonstrated behaviorally around that. I think, going back to what we were talking about in terms of parenting, I have a whole section when I develop family charters with families, and titled "How to Avoid Spoiled Brats." Effectively, how do we, and how do we have kids?
I'd love to know.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's not that difficult, but it's really important stuff. Again, not rocket science, but it goes back to that sense of parenting, of kids understanding the value of money, of kids actually understanding how lucky they are. They won the genetic lottery to some degree in this. And also, I'm a big believer in simple things like kids getting pocket money and having to earn money, right? And understanding, rather than just being given everything, they get an understanding. They have to go out and get a summer job. Again, this is not rocket science stuff. And I think it helps kids get a sense of the real world rather than this world that sort of exists that actually isn't reality for most people. So I think I see with good parents, there is communication, there is connection, there's an ability to, I guess, argue, right? To raise the difficult issues, and to challenge what is actually going on. And when you see that, what I call robust conversations, and so it's and that changes over time. As I said, when the kids are younger, it's basically the parents are in charge. But as they move on and get older, you build up what I call a level of respect between the parents and the kids, and so you'll find adults, good parents, listening to their kids and taking their opinion and hearing what they're actually saying. And so you're both providing a level of emotional security for kids. They know they're loved. They know, when they break the rules that, certain things will happen. And as they get older, they're being taught actually that, they are respected. So I know this sounds slightly broad in terms of what I'm saying here, but that combination of a sense of values, a sense of good parenting, and being able to really talk about the issues, raise it, talk about it. And sometimes those are awkward conversations. Sometimes those are difficult conversations. I've seen parents have to have conversations with their adult children, again, in a business context, around that the children aren't performing, right, at a business level, and that they might have to step down. That's a tough conversation, right? That's not an easy one. But
No.
if there is a expectation or a culture within the family of, we actually address issues, we don't just sweep them under the carpet, we don't play nice all the time, then that becomes a somewhat easier conversation. Not easy, but somewhat easier. And I think the chances of it being a successful conversation is much greater around that.
And so you've talked a little bit about some of the sort of tools, strategies that families are using to, I suppose, allow children, teens, adult children to not see money as a conceptual idea, but a practical resource to advantage the family and their lives. And so you talked about, as an example, giving pocket money to children, and obviously for doing whatever it might be, chores around the house and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Are there other nifty things that you've seen families do to elicit the ideas about what the child's values may be? So if you're catching what I'm trying to work out here, where we're using money in a way to determine what the kid's own internal values might be.
Yeah, and probably the main one around that is philanthropy. And I've seen wonderful examples where relatively young kids, teenagers, that sort of thing, are involved in the family's philanthropic activities. They go out and they see communities, for example, and work with communities where it's night and day compared to their experience. I know parents who will give a certain amount of money to each child and go, you decide where you want to put that money philanthropically, and come back to us and present to the family what you've done. So there's a real appreciation of what the advantages they have, and they see actually in many ways how lucky they are. So philanthropy is a really wonderful way of helping with that. And I know some families, there's all sorts of, there's a whole lot of complexity around philanthropy, but I think the families who are most hands-on with that and who really involve kids, it's not just a matter of just writing a check and giving money. You actually get involved, makes a profound effect. And then they can really see. I know a family where the parents were very involved in parts of Africa, and they've kept that connection, probably for 20 or 25 years, and they're passing that connection on to their children now. And you can absolutely see the benefits that their money is making in that, and for them, it's like there's a meaning, right? And in fact, for them there's an opportunity to really do some really extremely meaningful stuff around. And
are you seeing any examples of? And I know this could be quite fluid, but is it those families that are actually successfully communicating the difficult things, the conversations about money? Are you seeing a sort of cadence with the amount of connection points that they have within the family dynamic? Is it structured? Do they have structured meetings? Do they? Yeah. Is it more casual? Is it by design? Is what I'm trying to work out.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a deliberateness, right? And so when I'm working with families like this, we'll set up meetings, usually 2 a year, sometimes 3, where the family gets together and we'll talk about these issues. Now, they're always having conversations around, whether it's the dinner table and so on. But actually, as kids get older, they're off doing other things, right?
Yeah.
They've got their own, building their careers and their own families at times. So we'll often set up 2, maybe 3 meetings a year as a family to discuss and look at these issues. And those are really, I mean, they come across as a bit like a business meeting. And in some ways, I deliberately have that, but they're important discussions to have. And then as parents get much older, there's often really important decisions for the children to be talking about in terms of how do they support their parents. There starts becoming quite important conversations around wills and estate planning. And again, I think historically, I'm hoping it's much less these days, but historically, parents didn't want to talk about money with their kids. They didn't want them, didn't want to share that information.
Still occurs generationally.
I know it does occur. I'm just hoping it's a bit less. But actually, the more we can share and discuss with our older children, the better. I mean, I think. And this may be something you and I talked about in the past, but I think that example where, when a parent dies and suddenly the kids learn that there's millions of dollars, right, that they've got to do something with, they're completely unprepared for that.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to manage the money and what to do and so on. I think we need to prepare our children and get some financial literacy. And investment understandings and that sort of stuff. I mean, and I think that comes back to what I talk about, the transparency. And I mean, the example I always talk about is in a family council meeting, one of these twice a year meetings. The most wonderful example I've seen was the mum and dad and the kids sitting around the table, and the parents put their wills on the table. And said, here they are. Here's our wills. Any questions? And now, not every set of parents is going to do that, but it had an extraordinary effect on the kids because it was like full transparency. And in fact, that was probably 8 or 10 years ago now. But that has spurred a number of conversations. And for those children who are in their 30s now, are very aware that, there is money, right? And there will be money coming across to them. And the main conversation is how do we make sure that we work successfully around this and not get into arguments and fights over it. It's a great outcome. It's a fantastic outcome. The kids are actively working out strategies to avoid conflict and manage any conflict on that.
So for those families that don't have, say, a family business or perhaps, maybe don't have the amount of wealth necessitating an independent person coming in and doing this sort of thing, what I'm hearing is a kind of by design check-in with the family that is about transparency, is about education.
Yes.
It may be involving the financial advisor. It might be involving the estate plan solicitor, maybe the accountant that you'd go along with. Regardless of as a parent, your perception of whether the kids will understand, cope, or so on and so forth, I think giving the benefit of the doubt and having a growth mindset with respect to your kids and allowing them the opportunity to at least see seems to be a beneficial scenario. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And I think because you will get a range, almost always, of both skill and knowledge and understanding and ability, say around financial matters. So my musician isn't that interested in the finances, right?
Sure.
But other siblings in that family are. So there's that sense of you want everybody in the family in the next generation to have a broad understanding. Introducing them to advisors, financial advisors, and accountants and lawyers is really useful, so that they actually have a bit of a relationship. Because the odds are, when the parents pass, they have that ongoing relationship with them. They know them. They have a sense of trust and that sort of thing. And yes, some members of the family may not get all the intricacies. They may not understand the full tax implications or how the trust structures might work, or whatever it is, right? But at least they've had that shared with them. If they've got questions, they know they can go and talk to the advisors. And this is where the advisors are so important. because you build real trusting relationships, not just with the parents, but actually with the kids as well. And the value you provide is enormous, absolutely enormous.
So, as well as I'm thinking about this, I said at the outset that my contention was that having sound family relationships and generally good relationships with even friends external to this, the research is clear and it's evident that it improves life satisfaction and well-being.
Absolutely.
Can you explain some of the tangible ways in which the successful families that work together on these things have been able to, you can see that there have been a number of practical aspects of their life that you can see are flourishing as a result of the way that they handled these things?
So I think it is, no family's perfect, no parents are perfect, right?
No.
And there's often an assumption that siblings will just get on, and they don't sometimes,
No.
right? But if you've got a history of a sense of what it means to be part of this family, and even though your sibling is irritating the hell out of you, you still know and acknowledge that they're your sibling, right? And so there's enough of what I call a base or a foundation in that relationship, even though you might not see them that often, you might not like their partner, or you might not like them very much. You can still come together because you are family, right? And I call that is the glue. All right, there's an identification, and you get that from experiences together. You get that from history. You get that from a level of honesty, and you don't try and play happy families when it's not the case. And you're more invested when there is conflict in finding a resolution. I've got several families who do this, and there's a couple of them every so often fight like cat and dog. But the saving grace is that they're both invested in finding a way through, even if that takes them 6 months or 18 months, right? On that, sometimes time is very useful when we're trying to resolve a conflict. Sometimes it just takes a bit of time, to cool down or whatever it is. They might not see each other that much, but they've still got enough glue, enough of that foundation, whatever the right analogy is there, to stick it out.
But at least there's no, and I really think about this a lot. I think that we talk about sugar, we talk about smoking, we talk about mobile phone use as problematic, behaviors that affect our well-being. But what about bitterness? Bitterness, toxicity in relationships and bitterness. How does that affect the immune system? How does that affect us in older life? How does that affect us from disease prevention and all of those types of things? Yep. Managing this is fundamental to our own physical and mental health.
It is, and we know more and more, the research in aging, if you're connected to a community, which will invariably, a lot of the time will involve family, increases your longevity enormously. And I think that, and again, this is where, you start early, if there's that sense of bitterness within a family, somehow that's been allowed to occur or keep existing. You might not have been able to stop it from occurring, but you start addressing it, right? Because it's important, because family is important, and because people have both the skills and the preparedness to keep talking to one another, keep trying to find a way through. Every family fights, right? It's just it's just fact. There's this myth that we all get on wonderfully all the time. It doesn't happen.
That is a great segue, because one of the things I've been pontificating about, let's not have bitterness, and the reality of it is, even in my personal experience, doesn't matter what you do. Sometimes in family, there's conflict.
Yeah.
And so I know that you come in as part of what you do is about conflict resolution.
Yep.
So where there seems to be no, and that's a big theme geopolitically at the moment as well, but there seems to be no particular way that we can actually move forward and have a consensus
Mm-hmm.
How are you dealing with families that just don't see eye to eye on a particular issue? What are you doing to try to remedy that? And do you have a high success rate? And go for it.
Okay. So I think I have a higher success rate than quite a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I come at this from a couple of different angles. Traditional conflict resolution is you meet with people, you find out what's going on, and eventually you might get them in a room. And I do some of that. One of the risk factors in terms of failure is the length of time it's been going on, right? And so for me, if it is impossible to get people in a room, they've left it too long. The bitterness, to use your word, right? The anger is so great, I can't get them in the room. It still doesn't mean I can't do something, but it takes time and it takes a willingness to work with me on that. Because sometimes when it gets to that, people just go, I don't care. I'm just going away, right? And removing myself. But with conflict resolution, particularly within families, I do very in-depth interviews with the various parties. It might be two people, it might be more than that. And what I'm looking for is what is the common ground? And in families, there's always common ground. And often they get so caught up in the fight and the conflict that they miss actually the good stuff, the common ground stuff, the stuff that is actually really important. It's like I use the analogy of blinkers, right? The blinkers are so focused on the conflict, they miss the other stuff. And I'm equally challenging in those meetings their assumptions about the other person, because they'll be going, it's terrible and it's all their fault and so on and so on, right? And I don't buy into any of that because frankly, I don't know. They'll often want to go find out whose fault it is, who's to blame. And in conflict, there's no one person. Conflict, it takes two, right? And they'll both have parts in it. There's no doubt about that. So I'm looking for common ground. I'm challenging their assumptions. And with families, what I'm looking for is the love. And often that is deeply buried. And it takes time to actually uncover that and see what is actually, for them to actually go, there is something really important there on that. There are a couple of other things or techniques that I use, and they take a bit of setting up. But if I can get two people to do this, and it's really what's called a pattern intervention, and it's very hard work for them. It usually takes nearly half a day, but it is very much challenging them to open up their blinkers. And I work with each of them individually, and then I bring them together. And I remember a sister and brother that I worked with, and I went through this whole process with them, and they were exhausted at the end of it. But the sister at one point said, "Actually, what I want is my brother back, who always had my back when we were teenagers getting into trouble." Right. And the whole, she burst into tears, he burst into tears, the other family members are watching I burst into tears, right? And that bit of work was done a good decade ago, and they've never argued since, right? It just fundamentally opened up their viewing of and changed the viewing of the situation. And so I'm always optimistic. But there have been times when I haven't been able to do it because of circumstances. And often that is they've just allowed the conflict to really embed over years. They haven't addressed it. The earlier you address it, the better and the easier. And so that level of, again, to use your word, bitterness is so ingrained. Either we don't have the time. I've had one where two family members were arguing, and it was around a business situation. And then in the meantime, the father died, and his will came out, and they suddenly saw what the father really thought, and it just blew up, right? And it was just a disaster all around. or they get so exhausted they just go, oh, I don't care, I don't want to be involved, and they just walk away. And that's their choice, but there's a price to pay for that.
The strangest thing sort of came to mind, and my brain does this to me on occasions, but sometimes I undersell my mum. And I think about what you've been talking about with respect to this whole independent person coming in and trying to hear both sides and find the pieces of common ground. And I often tell my mum, don't get involved in this person's dispute. It's not your role to play. But when I hear what sometimes she's been able to achieve in her own way, and it's definitely not at the level that we're talking about here with what you do, but like effectively, it's exactly what you've described in its core, looking at both parties and asking them questions around, well, when you did get along, what were the things that you loved about each other? And, really focusing on that, and also challenging the assumptions and the perceptions that one has about what the other is doing, when potentially if things are fractured, you've got distance. And so that distance lends to more judgment and more mistakes.
And a reinforcement of the blinkers of how they're seeing the situation. And those blinkers close in and in and in. So all they see is this horrible person who I don't like and who irritates me and who I'm a fight with. So even just using your mum as an example, there's enormous value in just hearing what they're saying.
Yes.
Right? Getting them to put into words the way they see it, their construction of the problem, if you like. Now, where you add real value, and I have a feeling your mum probably does this, is listening, not judging, but equally not agreeing, not necessarily agreeing. Because often people in conflict will try and recruit somebody. Come and join me and take my side and we'll show that other person what a real bastard they are, right? So the job is not to be recruited and to often ask the question, so what do you base that on? What's your reasoning? What's your, and what way what's your assumptions, if you like, around how you make that particular thought process about them? And so by subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, not necessarily agreeing, they've really got to think a bit. And that helps, right? That sort of plants little seeds of doubt that maybe they're not quite seeing it the right way, right? So, and that's where people, friends, and family members can be so valuable. They don't have to be, a skilled mediator or something, but listening, not judging, but equally not agreeing necessarily, and asking so how did you get here, or what do you base that on? Type of questions. Why is that the case? Sort of thing.
Don't want to harp on the negative, Phil, but when you've seen that there's just no solution, or it feels like there is no solution anyway. There's probably always a solution. Why does it get to the point where it's just complete breakdown and failure? What are the telltale signs?
Well, the immediate one is, right, well, I can't get them in a room.
Gotcha.
Where it's so toxic, they just will not be in the same space together.
Yep.
Or where one is so determined to see the other as evil, as unredeemable, right? When you they just go, there's no point. It's all their fault. There's no point. They need to change. They have to change. And that starts worrying me when I start hearing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And inevitably there's been quite a long time period, we're talking years here, where none of this has been addressed. So they've been able to dig into their position and really hold that very solidly.
Yep.
Right. Those are warning signs for me.
It seems, I mean, I've had this kind of view for a while that it's rigidity in relationships
yes.
is what is what kills them.
Yep.
A lot of the time. Would that be a fair generic blanket that we could throw over the?
It's not a bad one. I mean, it's rigidity. It is you've really cut yourself off from your feelings.
Yeah. Okay.
Towards that person and what they might mean, and there's just no entertaining at all that there might be something different, or maybe how they're seeing it may not be fully 100% correct. It's that absolute certainty that I'm right. This is how the way I see it is correct and not budging, which I guess is your rigidity thing, right? Where it's like, okay, there is a real problem there. Yeah. And then they stop, and then they say, well, listen, I don't need to talk to you anymore, right? So they disengage. And then I really can't help. If they're engaging, yeah, there's always hope. But if they just move away, like, okay, I can't do that.
Yeah. You know, I'm mindful of the fact we're nearing the end of the episode, and I want to move away from the negative towards more the redemption stories. You know, is there something that comes to mind for you where you've seen what we've just described now, and you felt like, oh my God, how am I going to be able to turn this around? And then that has actually turned around. And if you can give us some specificity around that, that would be awesome.
So
without naming names.
Yeah. Look, I find I'm always optimistic, right? And I've dealt with some pretty heavy duty situations. I think, blood is thicker than water. And that power of family is strong. Right, even when people are disagreeing, and I've seen many families where I've been in meetings with them, and one family member has said something to another family member, and I'm going, oh well, they're buggered, and probably months later they've patched it up. Right, there's something that is quite remarkable in those family of origin relationships around that, and so I've seen families where I think there's that tolerance for disagreement, and to be able to argue things out, and still realize that actually there is a connection. And I see this a lot in families, and sometimes, and it's really that family I was talking about before, where I worked with the two siblings, and it was horrendous. And it took a lot of work and enormous credit to them to work with me in a very, very pressure cooker type environment. And a credit to them and a credit to the family, where actually what they did is they got in touch with the genuine love. Right, and I use that word deliberately because it exists in all families. Right,
you're talking about the example with the sister that was saying, "I'd just like to have my brother who had my back." Is that the one?
That's the one. Yeah, and it was a really bad case, right? And it was worrying, very worrying. Been brewing for a while, and that they rebuilt amazingly well.
How?
It was primarily they got in touch with they were able to see underneath the irritating components of each, because they both irritate each other, right? It's just many family members irritate each other, but they got back to the real connection that they actually had. Now, we did it in a timely way that conflict wasn't allowed to last for years and years and years. And so actually being able to get back to realizing that they actually had this really rather lovely history. Yes, they were different people, acknowledging that there are irritating components for each of them, but actually there was that connection underneath. And that I watched that relationship now over the years, and it moved from a sense of, yes, actually you are important in my life, now to very much a deeply respectful relationship between them. Now, if we hadn't have sorted that out, they could easily have become worst enemies in that particular case. And you see this, and often as I said, I'm looking for family members to actually see the love, to actually get that feeling back to that, sort of remove the conflict debris, if you like, down to actually you are an important person in my life. Right, and opening up the blinkers, and being able to connect again emotionally. Families are ultimately emotional. We don't fight with people as hard as we fight with family members because we're emotionally connected to them. Right, if we're fighting with a neighbor, it's a less emotional connection. Right, but we'll fight like cat and dog with our family members, right? Yeah. And so it's reminding them and getting them back in touch with that is really the key part.
So, what do you think the overarching message should be for this episode? What is it that we really want to tell the audience here?
Look, I think that there is there's the importance of genuine family relationships. An ability to have good conversations and to raise the issues, and an ability to parent well through all those stages. So that if you are a family with wealth, whether that's a business or whether that's just assets that you're passing along, that in fact you put some of those foundation stones in place of what it means to be part of this family and start answering and talking about that question. Then the likelihood of the real full benefits of that moving to not only the next generation but other ones is there, and that builds a genuine legacy and a culture of that family. And yes, acknowledge every family's going to have their arguments, all right, and people might break away for a period of time. It happens, but eventually they do come back. And family is that it's so important. It's not just the numbers, but if you get both working in tangent, then together, then you've got a pretty powerful combination.
So going forward for you, Phil, what's keeping you up at night? What's exciting for you? What's the next evolution of what you're doing?
So I enormously enjoy my work. I'm privileged to work with fascinating and interesting families, and I get to see what they do, how they do it, how they struggle with things. I've got a family recently where one of the children had died, and the impact and what that was doing and how they were managing and coping with that. And then the really amazing thing is actually for that family, when they got a whole lot of resolution in place and sorted out the succession plans and that sort of thing, you could see they were transformed. And it was interesting. It was both the parents and the kids were really transformed in that. And I think the joy for me in this work is seeing families rebuild, reconnect, and being able to get on, with their lives and take advantage of the things that I've really got. Yeah, that's what really drives me. So I'm starting a Q&A session with families, and people can submit whatever they like, and then we'll do an hour where we just go, let's just answer these questions, let's just address that, right? And I'm even including in-laws in this one because they're really interesting, right? Yes. And often they get such a bad rap, and yet they're so important. So there's that space of, particularly as I said at the beginning, when you've got wealth or business and family and you're combining all that together, the potential upside is really great, but there are things to be done. There's things you need to be consciously doing and putting in place around that. And it's, as I said, it's not particularly difficult, but important.
Phil, this has been a real eye-opener for me. I knew it would be. I love having conversations with you. I think the whole idea of it being this episode being accessible to anybody, whether they have a business or not. A lot of the themes that we've talked about are completely perfect
and universal.
And universal, right? Yeah, absolutely. For many different families, parents in different stages of their parenting journey as well.
Yep.
And so I really thank you for helping us in this particular area around family and relationships. And before I leave you, I was wondering if you were to be defined by a spirit animal.
What would I be?
The hardest question I'll ever ask you.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, actually, I've had some evolution on that front. By the way, I've been a number of different animals. I've got a new.
Is that
one
right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. But what's your spirit animal for now?
Look, my immediate answer, and I don't know how relevant this is. Right, I do a lot of sailing, and I'm very lucky. I sail in some particularly beautiful areas. And I think, and whether it is or whether I just would like it to be, my spirit animal is the sea eagle. I watch them, and they're watching them soaring. I've been lucky enough to see them actually hunting, and I think they're the most extraordinary animals. The Australian sea eagle is incredible.
May I bring it back to as well what you do for a living? You're kind of overseeing the sort of, as a macro level view, what's going on underneath you objectively. Maybe a sea eagle is kind of a good representation of that.
Well, it is, and then sometimes I dive straight into the detail as well, right?
Yes.
It is both, So I'll go with the sea eagle, and I think they're most extraordinary.
Good stuff, Phil. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
It's a huge pleasure, Joe, and it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have resonated in any way with the sentiments of this podcast, we would be delighted to direct you to our website, www.itsneveraboutmoney.com.au, for more free resources and education aimed at improving your capacity to make sound financial decisions for the benefit of your family. We wish you every success, however you define it.